The hook. He was trapped. The fog was a suffocating blanket, but he knew what lay beyond it. The entire British fleet in the East River at his back, and the most professional army on earth in front of him. His army was a collection of terrified farmers, his generals were amateurs, and he had just led them into the greatest military disaster of the war. The American Revolution was supposed to die right here, on the muddy shores of Brooklyn, in August 1776. The man responsible for this impending catastrophe was not a god. He was a 44-year-old Virginia planter named George Washington, and he was about to lose everything. The man who would not be king. To understand the man trapped on Long Island, the man who would somehow snatch a nation from the jaws of annihilation, one cannot look to the marble statues or the face on the dollar bill. One must look to the wilderness 22 years earlier, to a young, fiercely ambitious, and deeply insecure Virginia officer who, through a potent combination of arrogance and bad luck, inadvertently started a global war. In 1754, the world was a tinderbox. The Ohio Valley, a vast, fertile expanse west of the Appalachian Mountains, was the prize. Both the British and the French claimed it. Virginia's governor, Robert Dinwiddie, needed someone to deliver a cease-and-desist letter to the French forces encroaching on British-claimed territory. It was a fool's errand, a 1,000-mile round trip in the dead of winter through uncharted and hostile wilderness. The man who volunteered was 21-year-old Major George Washington. He was not yet the stoic icon. He was raw ambition. At over 6 feet 2 inches, in an era when most men were 5'7", he was a physical giant. His hands were the size of small hams. But beneath the imposing exterior was a man desperate for validation. He lacked a formal English education. He had been denied a commission in the regular British Army. He was, in his own mind, a colonial second-rater. This mission was his chance to prove his worth, to gain what he craved most: honor, reputation, and a king's commission. He delivered the letter, which the French politely ignored, but on his return he noted a perfect spot for a British fort, the forks of the Ohio, where the Allegheny and Monongahela rivers meet to form the Ohio River, modern-day Pittsburgh. Governor Dinwiddie, impressed by his resilience, sent Washington back the next spring, this time with a small regiment of 150 Virginia militia. His orders were vague: to defend the British fort being built at the Forks. But when Washington arrived, he learned the French had already overwhelmed the small British detachment and built their own, far superior fortress, Fort Duquesne. Now Washington was deep in enemy territory, vastly outnumbered, with a fragile alliance with a local Seneca chief known as the Half-King. The Half-King had his own agenda. He hated the French, who he felt had disrespected him, and he saw Washington as a tool to provoke a war. In the misty dawn of May 28, 1754, Tanacheran scouts reported a small French encampment hidden in a rocky ravine nearby. Washington, eager for his first taste of military glory, decided to act. He and his men, joined by the Half-King's warriors, surrounded the glen. What happened next is shrouded in the fog of propaganda and conflicting reports, but it would become known as the Jumonville affair. Washington gave the order to fire. The French, caught completely by surprise, were routed in minutes. 10 were killed and 21 captured. Their leader, Ensign Joseph Coulon de Villiers de Jumonville, was wounded. According to Washington's account, Jumonville was attempting to surrender, claiming he was on a diplomatic mission, just as Washington had been the winter before. But as Washington tried to read the Frenchman's papers, the half-king, in a sudden brutal act, stepped forward, said in French, "You are not yet dead, my father," and split Jumonville's skull open with a tomahawk. He then washed his hands in the man's brains. Washington was horrified, but powerless. He had lost control. He had, by any military standard, ambushed a diplomatic party. A 22-year-old provincial officer had just executed a French nobleman. The 7 Years' War, a conflict that would stretch across 3 continents and kill over 1 million people, had begun in that bloody glen. A terrified Washington retreated, expecting massive French retaliation. He led his men to a large clearing called the Great Meadows and ordered them to build a fort. The result was Fort Necessity, a pathetic waterlogged circular stockade built in a low-lying bowl surrounded by wooded hills. It was less a fortress than a slaughter pen. On July 3, 1754, the French arrived. It was Jumonville's brother, Louis Coulon de Villiers, leading 600 French Marines and 100 of their Native American allies. It was pouring rain. From the high ground, the French and their allies poured a merciless fire down on Washington's men, who were trapped in muddy, waist-deep trenches. Washington's troops, sensing the hopelessness, broke into the rum supply. By nightfall, the fort was a chaotic mess of mud, blood, and drunken, terrified militia. Washington had failed, utterly. At midnight, the French offered terms. Washington, with 1/3 of his men dead or wounded, had no choice but to surrender. The surrender document was in French, which Washington could not read. In the flickering candlelight, soaked to the bone, he signed the paper. Only later would he learn what he had admitted to. The document stated that the French attack was not an act of war, but a reprisal for the l'assassinat, the assassination of Ensign Jumonville. Washington had signed a confession, admitting to being a murderer. He returned to Virginia in disgrace. His name was notorious across the capitals of Europe. He had been humiliated. This failure would become the defining moment of his young life. It burned into him a lesson he would never forget: the danger of rashness, the necessity of absolute self-control, and the cruel reality of command. He had sought honor and found only infamy. The stoic, impassive, almost cold mask that Washington would later be famous for was forged in the mud of Fort Necessity. He did not, however, quit. The next year, 1755, he returned to the same wilderness, this time as a volunteer aide to the British professional, General Edward Braddock. Braddock was the perfect model of a European officer, brave, arrogant, and utterly contemptuous of savage warfare. He dismissed Washington's advice to break ranks and fight from behind the trees, insisting on marching his men in perfect, bright red columns. It was a disaster. Just miles from the fort, the French and their native allies ambushed them in the Battle of the Monongahela. They fired from the dense woods, turning the British column into a confused, terrified mob. Braddock was mortally wounded. Chaos reigned. But in the midst of the panic, Washington was reborn. He became the only officer on horseback not cut down. He rode everywhere, rallying the panicked Virginians, forming a rear guard, oblivious to the danger. When the smoke cleared, 2 horses had been shot out from under him. His coat and hat were found to have 4 bullet holes in them. He was, miraculously, unharmed. He had shown superhuman physical courage, and he had learned the second great lesson of his life, that the most professional army in the world could be defeated. He saw firsthand that rigid European tactics were useless in the American wilderness, and he began to believe what the Native Americans whispered, that he was protected by Providence, a man who could not be killed. This was the man who, 20 years later, the Continental Congress turned to. They didn't just see a wealthy planter, they saw the giant who had survived the Monongahela, the man who had already failed and learned from it. When he arrived in Philadelphia in 1775 to attend the Second Continental Congress, he was the only delegate wearing a military uniform. It was a silent, brilliant political maneuver. He wasn't lobbying for the job, he was being the job. When he accepted the command of the new Continental Army, he did so with genuine humility, a stark contrast to the rash boy of 1754. He refused to be paid, asking only that Congress cover his expenses. He knew better than any man in that room exactly what he was up against. He wrote to his wife Martha, "I feel great distress from a consciousness that my abilities are not equal to the extensive and important trust." Now, just a year later, in the fog on Long Island, that fear seemed realized. He had made a novice's mistake, splitting his army in the face of a superior force. The British had flanked him, just as the French had flanked Braddock. His army was broken, and his revolution was one sunrise away from extinction. He was back at Fort Necessity, but on a massive scale. This time, however, he was not the 22-year-old who panicked. He was the 44-year-old who had learned to master himself. As the night wore on, he stood on the shore, his massive frame a beacon of calm in the chaos, organizing the one thing that could save them, not a fight, but a retreat. The greatest gamble of his life was at hand.